Hi, and welcome to the Forgotten Women of History, the channel where I talk about women history conveniently forgot to give credit to. Every fact in these biographies is carefully checked, cross-referenced, and occasionally argued with. Historians disagree about plenty of it, and I'll tell you where. If you're watching without being subscribed, now's a good moment to fix that, and a like genuinely helps. It's how more people find their way to these strange, brilliant, complicated women's stories. All right, let's begin. On December 10, 1815, in a townhouse on Piccadilly Terrace, a child was born into a marriage already dying. Her mother, exhausted and frightened, held her only briefly before handing her to a nurse. Her father was elsewhere in the house, drunk, most likely, or raging, or both. He had wanted a son, he got a daughter, and he barely looked at her. They named her Augusta Ada. Within 5 weeks, her mother would pack a single trunk, take the infant, and leave in the dead of night, never to return. Within 4 months, her parents would be legally separated. Within a year, her father would leave England forever, chased out by scandal, debt, and whispers of a sin too dark for polite society to name aloud, an incestuous affair with his own half-sister, some said, though the truth of it has never been proven and likely never will be. His name was George Gordon Byron, Lord Byron, the most famous poet in Europe and quite possibly the most dangerous man a woman of sense could fall in love with. Ada would never remember his face. She would never hear his voice, but she would spend the rest of her life in his shadow, fighting it, running from it, and in the end, discovering that she had inherited more of him than anyone, including herself, ever wanted to admit. Her mother made sure of one thing above all else: Ada would not become her father. Annabella Milbank, Lady Byron, was a woman of rigorous intellect, devout faith, and an iron will that could have governed a small nation. She had loved Byron, foolishly, blindly, the way clever women sometimes love dangerous men, mistaking their darkness for depth. She had believed she could save him. She could not, and so, holding her infant daughter in that dark carriage riding away from Piccadilly Terrace, Annabella made a vow. Whatever made him a poet, whatever made him mad, whatever made him unfaithful and cruel and brilliant and doomed, I will cut it out of her if I have to cut away half her soul to do it. She very nearly did. Ada's childhood was not so much raised as it was administered. Annabella surrounded her daughter with a rotating cast of governesses and tutors whose primary function was not education but surveillance. Ada in later years would refer to them privately, with a dark humor that hinted at exactly how she felt about her upbringing, as the Furies. Every mood, every outburst, every flicker of imagination was recorded and reported back to her mother, who was frequently absent, traveling for her health or her causes, governing her daughter's life through letters and instructions relayed through intermediaries. Watch her closely. Annabella wrote to one governess in 1828 when Ada was 12. Any excessive excitement, any tendency toward the fantastical must be redirected immediately toward useful study. The useful study was mathematics. Lady Byron had a genuine gift for it. Byron himself had nicknamed her his Princess of Parallelograms, half in admiration, half in mockery of what he saw as her cold, joyless rationality. Now she wielded that same rationality as a weapon against the ghost of her ex-husband, arming her daughter with logarithms and geometry the way another mother might arm a child against illness with tonics and fresh air. Ada was forbidden even to see a portrait of her father until she was 20 years old. His name was rarely spoken in the household. And yet, how do you erase a man from a child's mind by refusing to speak of him? You don't. You only make him more powerful, wrapped in silence, dangerous precisely because he is unknown. One evening, when Ada was perhaps 7 or 8, a governess found her standing before a mirror in an empty room, murmuring something to her own reflection. When asked what she was doing, the girl said simply, "I was talking to him. I know he can't hear me, but I think he'd like to." The governess reported this to Lady Byron as evidence of morbid fancy requiring correction. Ada was given additional arithmetic lessons that week. She very nearly did. Despite, or perhaps because of, her mother's campaign, something in Ada refused to be fully tamed. At 12 years old, in the same year her mother was writing anxious letters about excessive excitement, Ada became fascinated by birds, not idly, obsessively, methodically, the way she would later approach every subject that captured her. She dissected the mechanics of wings. She studied proportions of feather to bone, the angle of a bird's ascent, the physics of lift and resistance. She produced a manuscript illustrated with her own careful drawings, titled Phoeology, a serious, almost scientific proposal for how a human being might one day achieve mechanical flight. It was not, on its surface, a rebellion. Her mother could hardly object to a child studying anatomy and physics. And yet it was a rebellion because what drove Ada toward the sky was not cold rationality, it was longing. It was the same restless, soaring imagination her mother had spent a decade trying to extinguish, dressed up in the language of science so that it might survive undetected. She was, in her own quiet way, already doing what she would spend her adult life perfecting, taking the wild, forbidden territory of imagination and translating it into the sober vocabulary of mathematics, a language her mother could not punish her for speaking. In 1829, when Ada was 14, measles swept through the household. She survived the fever, but the illness left her partially paralyzed. For nearly 3 years, she could not walk without assistance. She spent much of that time confined to bed and later hobbling on crutches, her body betraying her at precisely the moment when other girls her age were beginning to move through the world with new freedom. It would have broken many children. It did not break Ada. Confined to her room, unable to run or dance or do any of the physical things denied to her, she did the only thing left available to a mind as restless as hers. She read, voraciously, relentlessly, in every subject her tutors could provide, mathematics above all, under the guidance of the mathematician Augustus de Morgan, who quickly recognized that his young pupil possessed something rarer than diligence. She possessed intuition. She grasped concepts other students merely memorized. "Your power of thinking on these matters," De Morgan wrote to her mother, "with a note of genuine astonishment, seems to me for your years extraordinary." She recovered enough to walk again by 17, though she would never again enjoy robust health, but something had shifted permanently. The bedridden girl who once dreamed of birds in flight now dreamed in equations, and in 1833, at a London party, she would meet the man who could show her a machine that might, one day, dream alongside her. The drawing room was warm with candlelight and the low murmur of London's intellectual elite. Scientists, mathematicians, a smattering of minor aristocracy trading gossip disguised as philosophy. Ada, 17 years old, newly presented to society, stood near a window, only half, listening to the conversation around her, when her tutor and mentor Mary Somerville took her gently by the arm. "There's someone I want you to meet." Mary said. "Mr. Babbage has brought something extraordinary." Charles Babbage was already, by 1833, something of a legend in scientific circles, brilliant, notoriously difficult, and chronically exasperated by a government that refused to fund what he considered the most important invention of the century. He stood beside a strange arrangement of brass gears and rods, a machine unlike anything Ada had ever seen, explaining its function to a small cluster of onlookers whose eyes had already begun to glaze with polite incomprehension. This, Babbage was saying, with the particular impatience of a man who has explained something too many times to people who will never understand it, calculates mathematical tables automatically, without human error. Most of his audience nodded and drifted toward the refreshments. Ada did not drift. She stepped closer, studying the arrangement of gears with an intensity that made Babbage pause mid-sentence. "How does it know?" she asked. "Which calculation to perform next?" Babbage looked at her properly for the first time, not as a young lady to be humored, but as someone who had asked, in a single sentence, the only question that actually mattered. "That," he said slowly, "is rather the heart of the matter, isn't it?" They talked for nearly an hour. Ada asked question after question, each one sharper than the last, until Babbage, a man not easily impressed and rarely patient with anyone who couldn't keep pace with his mathematics, found himself in the unusual position of struggling to keep pace with her. "Miss Byron," he said finally, "I don't believe I have met anyone, man or woman, who grasped the principle so quickly." "Perhaps," Ada said, with the faint smile that would later characterize her letters, "you haven't been introducing it to the right people." It was the beginning of a partnership that would outlast marriages, financial ruin, illness, and nearly 2 decades of professional disappointment. Neither of them could have known, standing in that overheated drawing room, that they had just set in motion one of the strangest and most consequential intellectual friendships of the 19th century. In July 1835, Ada married William King, a quiet, steady man who would later be elevated to the Earl of Lovelace, making her, for the rest of history, Ada, Countess of Lovelace. Unlike her mother's disastrous union with Byron, this marriage was, by every account, genuinely companionable. William supported her intellectual pursuits rather than fearing them, and over the following 4 years, she gave birth to 3 children, Byron, Anne Isabella, and Ralph, while continuing to study mathematics with an intensity that most Victorian wives, occupied entirely with domestic duty, would have found unthinkable. She was, by all accounts, a devoted if unconventional mother, writing to her children about mathematics as easily as other mothers wrote about manners, treating her sons and daughter as minds to be cultivated rather than merely raised. But domesticity never fully satisfied her. Beneath the surface of Countess Lovelace, dutiful wife, mother of 3, mistress of a comfortable estate, the restless mind of the girl who once dissected bird wings was still very much alive, still hungry, still waiting for a problem large enough to consume it. That problem arrived in 1842 in the form of a French scientific paper and an Italian engineer's account of a machine that, by then, existed mostly in Charles Babbage's increasingly desperate imagination. By the early 1840s, Babbage had moved on from his original difference engine to something far more ambitious, the analytical engine, a machine that would not merely calculate fixed tables, but could, in theory, be instructed to perform any calculation, a general-purpose thinking machine built entirely of brass and steel, a century before anyone else would seriously attempt such a thing, the British government, unimpressed and unwilling to fund a project they only half understood, had already begun quietly abandoning Babbage. He was running out of money, running out of patience, and running out of allies. Then, in 1842, an Italian engineer named Luigi Menabrea published a paper in French based on lectures Babbage had once given in Turin, describing the theoretical workings of the analytical engine. Ada, now 26, married, a mother of 3, was asked by Babbage to translate the paper into English. It should have been a simple, almost clerical task: render the French into serviceable English prose, hand it back, move on to the next domestic obligation waiting for her attention. She could not leave it alone. Sitting at her writing desk late into the night, long after the household had gone quiet, Ada found herself doing something the translation didn't require. She began adding her own thoughts in the margins, first a clarifying sentence here, an elaboration there, and then, as the ideas multiplied faster than she could contain them, entire pages of original analysis that had nothing to do with translating Menabrea's French and everything to do with a vision only Ada seemed able to see clearly. "I am doubtful," she wrote to Babbage in one of the many letters that flew between them that year, "whether I have not too much presumed in the length and character of some of my notes." But Babbage, when he saw what she was producing, did not tell her to scale back. Quite the opposite. "Do not put yourself in the position of confining your thoughts," he wrote back. "Let them run free." She did. By the time she finished, her notes ran nearly 3 times the length of the original paper, labeled simply A through G, as though modesty required she disguise the scope of what she'd actually written. The translation had become something else entirely, a document that would outlive its source material by more than a century and outlive its author by considerably longer than that. Late at night, by candlelight, with a household asleep around her and a mind that refused to rest, Ada worked through Note G, the section that would eventually be recognized as the first published computer program in history. It was not a metaphorical claim. She specified with mathematical precision the exact sequence of operations the analytical engine would need to perform in order to calculate Bernoulli numbers, a complex sequence important to mathematics. Variable assignments, looping instructions. The machine, as she described it, would need to repeat certain operations, check conditions, and adjust its calculations based on results it had not yet produced. The fundamental logic, in embryonic form, of every piece of software written in the 2 centuries since. She was writing an algorithm for a machine that did not exist, that would never be built in her lifetime, that Babbage himself would die without completing. And yet she wrote it with the same rigor she might have applied to a problem that could be tested the following morning. But it was not the algorithm alone that made Note G extraordinary. Somewhere in the process of writing it, Ada arrived at an insight that even Babbage, the machine's own inventor, had not fully articulated. The analytical engine, she wrote, might act upon other things besides number. She imagined that if the fundamental relationships of music, pitch, harmony, the mathematical structure beneath melody, could be expressed as symbols, the machine could, in principle, compose. Not merely calculate, create. She was describing in 1843 something the world would not possess a vocabulary for until the 20th century. A general purpose machine, limited not by its mechanics, but by the imagination of whoever gave it instructions. She was describing software before anyone had coined the word. And in the same breath, with the same unflinching honesty that characterized everything she wrote, she made sure to note the machine's limits as clearly as its possibilities. The analytical engine has no pretensions whatever to originate anything, she wrote. It can do whatever we know how to order it to perform. A century later, a mathematician named Alan Turing would read that sentence, disagree with it in a landmark paper on machine intelligence, and feel compelled, despite disagreeing, to name her directly, to answer an argument made by a woman who had been dead for nearly 100 years. He called it Lady Lovelace's objection. He never fully defeated it, neither, arguably, has anyone since. What the notes do not show, what they were never meant to show, was the woman writing them at 2 a.m, exhausted, in pain, and increasingly desperate for a kind of relief that mathematics alone could not provide. By the mid-1840s, Ada's health had begun a slow, punishing decline. She suffered from a variety of ailments that her doctors, working with the limited understanding of Victorian medicine, treated with laudanum and other opiate tinctures, remedies dispensed with the same casual frequency modern doctors might prescribe aspirin. Ada, unsurprisingly, given how they were administered, developed a dependency that would shadow the final years of her life. And there was another appetite, less easily explained by illness, that had taken hold of her by this point, gambling. Ada had developed an obsession with horse racing, convinced, with the same misplaced confidence, that had once led her mother to believe she could reform Lord Byron, that mathematics could crack the seemingly random outcomes of the racetrack the way it cracked any other problem. She developed elaborate betting systems, borrowed money to fund them, and lost, repeatedly. By some accounts, she accumulated gambling debts that reached well into the thousands of pounds, a staggering sum for the era, forcing her, at one particularly desperate point, to pawn the Lovelace family jewels without her husband's knowledge. There were also, according to several biographers, romantic entanglements outside her marriage during these years, relationships never definitively proven, given how carefully Victorian correspondence tended to be either destroyed or coded, but persistent enough in the historical record that most serious accounts of her life acknowledge them as, at minimum, plausible. It would be easy and perhaps comforting to tell Ada's story as a straightforward tale of genius triumphing over adversity. The truth is messier and in some ways more human. The same restless intensity that allowed her to grasp the analytical engine's potential more completely than its own inventor also drove her toward the racetrack, toward debt, toward the very kind of self-destructive impulse her mother had spent a lifetime trying to engineer out of her. She had spent her childhood being told that her father's blood carried a dangerous inheritance. Instability, excess, and inability to govern one's own appetites. Annabella had fought that inheritance with mathematics, with discipline, with relentless supervision, and for years it had seemed to work. But blood, as it turns out, does not respond well to supervision. Ada seemed to sense this herself and to fear it. In letters from this period, she wrote about her own mind with a kind of anxious self-awareness, describing what she called her tendency toward excitability and expressing a genuine fear that she carried within her the same volatile temperament that had destroyed her father. She was not merely brilliant. She was, by her own admission, afraid of her own brilliance, afraid of what it might cost her, the way it had cost Byron everything. In the summer of 1850, Ada began experiencing symptoms she initially dismissed: persistent pain, exhaustion beyond what even her fragile health could explain. By 1851, doctors had confirmed what she likely already suspected: uterine cancer, at a stage medicine of the era had no meaningful tools to address. She spent nearly 2 years in slow, escalating agony. The opiates that had once merely eased her chronic pain now became the only mercy medicine could offer her, administered in doses that left her drifting between clarity and confusion. Through it all, she continued corresponding with Babbage when she was able, though the letters grew shorter, the handwriting less certain. There is a particular cruelty in the timing worth noting. Annabella, the mother who had spent decades trying to control and shape her daughter, arrived at Ada's deathbed and, by several accounts, used those final weeks to extract a series of confessions about the gambling, about the debts, about whatever romantic indiscretions had occurred, even as her daughter lay dying. Whether this was maternal concern or a final, desperate act of control is a question biographers still argue over. Knowing Annabella, it was very possibly both. Ida died on November 27, 1852, at 36 years old, the exact age at which her father had died. A symmetry so precise that several people close to her remarked on it at the time, as though some inherited clock had simply run out on schedule, at her own explicit request, made while she was still lucid enough to insist on it. She was buried beside Byron, the father she never knew, whose portrait she wasn't permitted to see until she was 20, whose name was barely spoken in her childhood home. In death, she chose to lie next to him anyway. Whatever her mother had tried to erase, Ada, in the end, refused to let it go. For over a century after her death, Ada Lovelace remained a footnote, mentioned occasionally in accounts of Babbage's work, rarely credited as anything more than a talented translator who happened to be the daughter of a famous poet. The analytical engine itself was never completed. Babbage died in 1871, still fighting for funding, still convinced of a future that wouldn't arrive until long after he was gone. Ada's notes sat largely undisturbed in archives, read by a handful of mathematicians, absent from the story computing told about its own origins. It took the actual invention of electronic computers in the mid-20th century for historians to go back and reread what she had written and to realize, with something like retroactive astonishment, that she had described the fundamental logic of programming before anyone had a machine capable of running it. In 1980, the United States Department of Defense named a newly developed programming language, Ada, in her honor. It remains in use today in systems where reliability is non-negotiable, aviation defense, railway systems, a quiet, fitting tribute to a woman who wrote code for a machine that existed only in brass fragments, and a dying man's unfinished ambition. There is a version of this story that ends with irony. Annabella spending a childhood trying to purge imagination from her daughter, convinced it was Byron's most dangerous legacy, only to watch that same imagination become the very thing that made Ada extraordinary. That version is true as far as it goes. But it isn't the whole picture, and I don't think it's the most important part. The most important part is this: Ada Lovelace did not simply inherit two warring halves of her parents, a poet's imagination and a mathematician's rigor, and get lucky when they happen to combine well. She spent her entire life, consciously and often painfully, trying to reconcile them. She gambled and lost because she believed mathematics could tame chance the way it tamed everything else. She feared her own mind because she'd been taught from childhood that intensity was dangerous, that feeling too much and imagining too freely were symptoms of something inherited and incurable. She wrote, in one of her most quietly devastating letters, that she hoped to use her gifts for something worthy. Since I cannot exist without some object in view, a woman who understood, better than almost anyone around her, that a mind like hers needed a task large enough to hold it, or it would simply consume itself. The analytical engine gave her that task. And what she saw in it? A machine that could be instructed to do more than calculate, that could in theory manipulate any symbol according to any rule, limited only by the imagination of whoever programmed it, was, in a very real sense, a description of her own mind, logical and disciplined enough to satisfy her mother, wild and associative enough to have satisfied her father, had he ever had the chance to know her. Today, Ada's name is everywhere in a field still overwhelmingly built by and for men. Ada Lovelace Day, observed every October, celebrates women in STEM around the world. Scholarships, coding academies, university buildings, an entire programming language still running quietly inside airplanes and railway systems. All of it carries her name, mostly to people who have no idea about the racetrack debts, the opium, the fear of her own mind, the father she visited only through silence and a locked portrait. That absence of detail isn't an accident. It's easier to canonize a genius than to sit with a complicated woman, someone who was brilliant and reckless, disciplined and self-destructive, capable of imagining software a century before the word existed, and equally capable of pawning her own jewelry to cover a gambling debt. But I'd argue the complicated version is the one actually worth remembering, not because it makes her more relatable, though it does, but because it makes her achievement more remarkable, not less. She wrote the first algorithm in human history while fighting a body that was failing her, a mind she didn't fully trust, and a mother who never stopped trying to author her daughter's life from a distance. She never saw a single computer built. She died not knowing whether anything she'd written would matter to anyone, and she turned out to be one of the reasons the entire field exists at all. That, I think, is worth a lot more than a footnote. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe and give it a like. It really does help more people find out about such complex and remarkable life stories. See you in the next video.